Roger Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the river hole in the white box, and this was inspired by the conversation we had on Cadell Last channel on his book, Systems and Subjects, which I had a delight of being part of with Dr. Thomas Hammelrick, Tim Adelin, and Layman Pascal. And I really enjoyed Cadell's book. I highly suggest it. You can find it on Amazon. If you've already purchased and read it, please leave a review. All reviews on Amazon are a huge help. And I think this book is very important. It definitely, I think, is framing a really important issue that has to be thought, especially as we move into, say, Belonging Again, the address. We recently released Belonging Again, the explanation, but next will have to be the address. And we really have to think about now, today, the relation between system and subject, and I would even get into things like subject and society. I think these things are all very related. And how, if we don't have sociological givens anymore, then choice, the individual's relation to the world, how they choose to organize themselves, all these things are going to be really, really important. And the quality of our choices, the quality of our ability to handle lack, subjectivity, and so on and so forth are all going to be very, very important. And these are all the topics that Cadell is thinking, and he's thinking quite profoundly. It is difficult to think systems, a radical challenge to consider subjects, and Cadell Last has decided to think both. Belonging Again is going to be arguing that you have this kind of sociological tension between givens and releases, or kind of trade-off between givens and releases. And this is based on the Triumph of the Therapeutic with Philip Reeve. And if humans have to choose everything, they're existentially overwhelmed and tend to turn to totalitarianism. Now, please note, what's very important is, although releases and givens is a dialectical structure, we can't return to givens because givens only work if you don't think about them. Once you know about givens, say, for example, once you know you don't have to be Christian, that you could just as easily have been Hindu, then you can't really go back to Christianity being given, something that just is without thinking about it. Givens kind of held us back from realizing the very dialectic between givens and releases, and once you know about it, you actually realize that society is fundamentally incomplete in a kind of Gödel way, meaning it can't be its own grounding. And it only worked because you didn't know it couldn't be its own grounding, that it was given that it was grounded. And once you know that it is not, the fundamental incompleteness of society is unavoidable. And these are the sections of the conflict of society and the value circle that are described in Belonging Again. So you have this fundamental incompleteness. And I think what we see in Cadell's book is also an emphasis on fundamental incompleteness as really the problem that we have to address in terms of the subject and the system. And also, humans tend to create systems to avoid fundamental incompleteness. And I think we see that with societies. Societies were created precisely to avoid the impossibility of a philosophical grounding by not letting us think about them, by making it given that, say, Christianity was a fundamental grounding. So you didn't think about it, but now that you think about it, you realize that a fundamental grounding is impossible. And this, now we have to move into different metaphysical conceptions, such as what we find in a Hegel, or some of the thinkers of the modern counter-enlightenment. But the point is that now we realize that incompleteness is a fundamental characteristic of being. So if we are not careful, we as subjects might create systems to avoid this fundamental incompleteness. But what if we were to instead face it? What if we were to instead integrate with it, and to instead look at it as something to come to terms with, not to avoid? Well, two phrases that come up in the book that this paper is going to focus on is like the river hole and the white box. The river hole is going to be combining together kind of the Lacanian hole. The river in Nietzsche is the becoming. And there's this idea is, could the lack that you have in Lacan actually be a source of becoming in a Nietzschean sense? Could actually, there's a paper we also have that talks about fundamental incompleteness. The lack of Lacan is precisely why it's possible for us to be intrinsically motivated. Precisely because we can't find an object of desire, that there is no object that will finally fulfill us, there is no big other, blah, blah, blah. All of this is precisely why we can be the source of our own motivation, because we can, in that incompleteness, then always be completing ourselves, always have something to do, and therefore we never get bored. And it does really seem that human beings are the kind of beings of whom are better off when they always have something to do. But at the same time, that could look like busy work, that could look like escapism. So how do we always have something to do that doesn't function as a kind of escapism or a kind of distraction. I think this is the real challenge, and I think that's where you have to get into things like the Nietzschean child, sacrifice, passion, living for your own values, even if other people don't appreciate them, etc., so forth. And also you could even get into the three infinities: beauty, goodness, and truth. It was kind of funny. Dimitri, in one of the recent net conversations, pointed out, he was quoting someone on the idea that there are two tragedies in life: not getting what you want and getting what you want. And how do we navigate that tension? And it's interesting to think that the three infinities are things that even if you get them, you never get them in their entirety. So maybe the three infinities, like no matter how much beauty you get, you can always want more beauty, right? But there is a point where you don't want any more food. But there is no point where you don't want any more beauty or goodness or truth. And yet, even if you get beauty, you never get all of beauty. There's still more to get. So maybe the three infinities are an example of something that you get, but never get all of them. So they can kind of navigate between these tragedies of getting what you want and not getting what you want. And navigating, and likewise with lack, once you understand that you are fundamental lacking, that you can't ever overcome incompleteness, then you're not going to create systems or societies trying to overcome its own incompleteness. Rather, you're going to see this as a source of possible creation, possible newness, possible life. And you know you're never going to get something that's going to fill that lack, but actually not getting that thing to fill the lack is precisely why you always have work to do, why you have the possibility of intrinsic motivation. And this not being escapism, but actually an integration with how reality actually is like. And so this is kind of the tightrope we have to walk, to allude to Nietzsche. This is what we have to figure out how to navigate and do. And I think we see in Systems and Subjects a deep awareness of this problem in moving forward, trying to figure out how we might balance it, how we might design systems and subjects in a way that isn't avoiding the hole that could then be a river hole. The other term in the title being the white box, I find that really lovely. There's this idea you have a black hole that sucks all matter in, and a white hole being a kind of theoretical possibility at the beginning of the universe that pushes all matter out. It's kind of the source of creation. And there's this idea of if human beings of whom are stuck in their subjectivity could be a white box, which is precisely to say that we are in a box, we're unable to escape ourselves, but maybe this very inability to escape is the precondition of being a source of creation. Or negantopathy, this is a term I cannot say, but it's the opposite of entropy. And negantopathy is a term that permeates the book, and I think it's very important. And really, Cadell is also going to critique or draw attention to how in science there seems to be this kind of love and obsession with entropy. And this could be a manifestation of a death drive of some of the scientists, this kind of desire. Also, too, if the universe is going to die in a heat death, I'm not responsible for trying to change that. There's a way in which if we're all going to just kind of if everything's going to be lost in a heat death and it's meaningless, then there's a kind of liberation that comes from that, because then I don't have to be responsible for meaning. And I also don't have to worry about, say, doing studies or work that help subjects be sources of creativity. And I'm going to say creativity instead of negantopathy, because I cannot say negantopathy, so creativity. But by that by creativity, I mean the reverse of entropy. And, if you take seriously creativity, then you're responsible for systems and subjects that are capable of creativity. And, that's a lot of work. You're probably going to have to come to terms with your desires, your psychology, your lacks, and all of that is really, really hard. And you can avoid that by simply saying, oh, well, the universe is going to be lost in a heat death. So, and then, of course, what you see here is if you believe the universe is going to be lost in a heat death and that entropy is unavoidable, well, then you're going to make systems that are basically just in the image and likeness of that worldview. You're not going to try to create systems that incubate creativity, because what's the point? And at the end of the day, you might not even believe in the possibility of reversing entropy in some sense. Or fighting against entropy, or offering alternatives of entropy. And, Cadell, in a number of the videos on his own YouTube channel, is going to be emphasizing the work of Bert Lamfary. And Cadell will also talk about the possibility of what if subjectivity is the points in the universe where entropy can be reversed, or where creativity, nectopathy, could enter into? What if subjectivities are river holes or white boxes? Are we so sure it is not? And it seems like subjectivity is a lack, merely a lack, but what if that lack is kind of an opening by which creativity can enter into the universe? These are things we should consider. And if you took that seriously, you would design different systems, you'd design different societies, you'd do different kinds of work. And this would also suggest that our view of subjectivity is really consequential, because, say, if you believe that entropy is inevitable, and you see this is very consequential, because if you say, oh, entropy is inevitable, then you're going to develop systems that reinforce that idea, and of course then subjects will conform to that systems, and it becomes self-reinforcing. Kierkegaard has that idea that the man in despair is the one who doesn't know he's in despair. So, likewise, if indeed systems and subjects are profoundly connected, that the systems we make reflect our notion of subjectivity, and the subjectivity we form is going to be incubated and influenced by our systems, then we have to, this is a very radical choice that is going to conceal its own kind of origin, or it's going to conceal what it's hiding us from in the act of creating systems. So this is very important. It's very important that we, here I think you can see why ontology, metaphysics, philosophy in general can't be avoided, because the framework by which you understand the universe then determines how you carry yourself in the universe, which then reinforces that framework. You're going to have experiences that reinforce that framework. You can view this, we'll talk about the absolute choice, which is the choice that is radically abyssal because it's its own grounding, but the choice is creative. Like what you choose, of which is just the raw choice, then creates the conditions that are a result of that choice, that confirm that choice. In this way, we can also talk, something that's kind of interesting to me is that thinking and dreaming become much more similar if human subjectivity is not as bound to its determinations as we think. Like if we are more able to choose the systems that we create that then changes the subjectivity that is organized by those systems, then thinking and dreaming are much closer. But the funny thing is about a dream, a dream at the end of the day you can say is arbitrary, you wake up from, and so you escape from. So there's a way to kind of not own your dreams. Arguably, a dream you had to own could be a kind of nightmare, because then what's expressed in the dream would say something about you, what you wanted, what your desires. And so one of the things that's nice about dreams is at the end of the day we can say, oh, it was all fantasy and I'm not responsible for them. But if thinking and dreaming are drawn closer together, because humans are more creative than maybe they want to be. Because if you're creative, then there's the question of what will you create and why did you create X versus Y? All of that becoming existentially horrifying. Well, this means we kind of have to own our desires and our wants and ourselves. If you've ever written a story or a book, you've probably gotten questions of, oh, why did you make a character do something like this? Or why did you have a murderer? Are you saying murder's okay? You can be asked all these questions about why you created X instead of Y. And that can be very difficult because people can be very mean. People can be very judgmental. If you chose to write about something, or people will say, oh, if you're writing about problems with capitalism, maybe that says you hate capitalism and don't you respect how hard your family has worked to provide for you or something, right? They think that a critique of capitalism means you don't respect what people have done. Now, of course, none of that follows, but the point is that the act of creation then makes something that people can judge you in light of. And that can be a reason people don't create, because they don't want to be judged in light of that thing. Well, if thinking and dreaming are really tied together, then that means the human subjectivity is very creative, and that means we're going to, in the act of create, or it means that a creative subject has to put themselves up for judgment. They have to be vulnerable to judgment because people have to see what you create, and that's very existentially difficult. So we may try to avoid that by separating system and subject, or not viewing ourselves as a river hole or a white box, because we don't want to be judged. We don't want to face that anxiety. But here's the thing, if we don't face that anxiety, I think Cadell is giving us a very compelling case for why that will be extremely consequential. Certainly we won't engage in creativity nectopathy, we'll just fall into entropy. But as I think the belonging, again, the address we'll have to get into is this act of creation, this act of choice, seems to be necessary for the negation sublation of society. It seems to be like when we're talking about the address of what has been explained in Belonging Again, it's going to get into a lot involving intrinsic motivation, creativity, and the conditions that make those possible, which seem to require choice, absolute choice, quality of decisions, vulnerability, courage, and so on and so forth. Well, that's going to mean you have people that are more at home with existential tensions. And if we don't become more at home with those existential tensions, we're probably just going to keep falling into classical ways of getting meaning and belonging, which are totalitarian or xenophobic or whatever. And so that's a real challenge. And I think what Cadell is putting forth in this book, like if we take it all very seriously, it's part of the conversation of what the Belonging Again address has to look like. And I think that's very, very important. Cadell on his channel will talk about the different angles the book comes from. He's going to be talking about Hegel, Nietzsche, he'll talk about Heidegger, he talks about Freud, he's going to talk about psychoanalysis, he's going to be talking about how we can't separate psychoanalysis from systems building or systems thinking, how the unfolding of systems thinking is relative to the subject, and and also ultimately this will tear down the subject-object divide as we get in Hegel. Which we can say is all good and well, but then we can't blame objects for being in our way. We have to take responsibility for it. And I think the book is really magnificent. I think it opens so much up. I think Cadell has given us an amazing work. I think thinking this way is going to prove all the more important given AI. He also had a lovely conversation with Dawood, I would suggest, giving a choice. And we have to learn to avoid temptations of equilibrium. Equilibrium ultimately becomes kind of death. So we have to learn to be dynamic and alive. He makes the point, there's this lovely, to quote from the book, absolute closures are doomed to equilibrium because no matter what field they exist within, eventually the environment will change so much that their knowledge structures will no longer be fit for action. Thus, eventually, they will hit a state of equilibrium, but the self-organizing symbolic drive in itself will continue to participate in the strange loop between chaotic information fields in ordered knowledge practices that are best suited to explore these fields. Can we be the kind of subjects that can accept that reality, integrate with it, and be river holes instead of white boxes? I think that's our challenge. If we cannot overcome that challenge, then we'll probably undergo auto-cannibalism and self-effacement. But I think with a book like this and Cadell's work in general, we have resources to help us face the occasion of today. So please check out Systems and Subjects. And for more by Cadell Last, please check philosophyportal.online. And thank you so much for your time.